talks, the IMS lectures has been provided in the chat. And welcome once again to an IMS student lecture series talk. Today we have Alan Carr joining us for part 2 of his talk on the Manhattan Project. Alan is the senior historian for the laboratory, and he was hired by the lab in 2003 after completing his graduate work in history at Texas Tech University. He has appraised thousands of sets of records held by the laboratory organizations for historical value and produced several publications pertaining to the Manhattan Project, nuclear weapons testing, and the lab's development during the Cold War. He's very graciously joining us again for the second part of his talk, and I will let you take it away, Alan.
Let me unmute myself there. Roxanne, hey, thank you for that introduction, and my thanks to you and Kelly and Michael and all of you who have tuned in today, especially those of you who have come back for part 2. I hope that you're all doing well, and I think that we'll jump into it here in just a moment. Now, hopefully you were here yesterday as well, and you remember some of those disclaimers that I started out with. Today we'll get into subjects like the Trinity test, the end of World War II, the use of atomic bombs to help bring the war to an end. There's a lot of perspectives on that, and so I will be presenting kind of my perspective on it. I'll be referencing sources that I think are important to shaping the way things, why things happen the way that they did. You go to different historians, you may get a very different story. And so let me strongly encourage you to seek out those other perspectives. I will try to allude to some of them as we go through the material today. But anyway, we'll have our discussion, and then I will be looking forward to Q&A with you in just a little while. So you'll remember we finished our discussion yesterday by talking about the 3 major sites of the Manhattan Project. These, of course, were Hanford, Oak Ridge, and we finally, at the very end of the talk, got to Los Alamos. And so just as we get to Los Alamos, we're actually going to take a step back and look at the wider Manhattan Project and look at some major developments that are happening. So you'll recall that Oppenheimer and General Groves, they selected Los Alamos as the site for the weapons design laboratory very late in the year in 1942. Now, at about the same time, one of the greatest experiments of all time was performed at the University of Chicago as part of the Manhattan Project. The world's first reactor, known as Chicago Pile 1 or CP1, was constructed there by Enrico Fermi and his team. You can see Enrico there in the picture on your right. He is on the front row over on the extreme left. This, and I should mention with Enrico, very interesting story there. We talked about a lot of foreign-born scientists who were involved in the Manhattan Project in the last talk, and Enrico, of course, is another one of the great scientists, not just of the 20th century, but maybe of all time. He was able to escape fascist Italy because he won the 1938 Nobel Prize. He was allowed to go collect the prize with his wife and instructed by the fascist government in Italy to come right back afterwards. He went, got his prize, and came to the United States instead. Ends up at the University of Chicago and ultimately at Los Alamos. But let's talk about this work at Chicago and why it's important. Now, I believe somebody yesterday had asked about the paper on Canadian contributions to the Manhattan Project. And Tom Mason was one of the co-authors on that paper. I did get a request for that, and I sent it out. I do respond to my emails, as some of you found out. And anyway, Tom, the director, if you will, he did make note that at this point in time, whether an atomic bomb would work was itself very sensitive information. We didn't know at this point in time. And that changed when Fermi and his team initiated the world's first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction at the University of Chicago. This experiment was performed on December 2nd, 1942. And if you can perform a controlled nuclear reaction, you can also initiate an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. And what is an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction? Well, essentially an atomic bomb. And so we knew that it could be done from this point forward. And that was a major, major advantage that the United States has. And so debate amongst yourselves in chat. What do you think? Greatest experiment of all time? Is it in your top 5, your top 10? Where does it rank? Well, what was it like to be in the room for that experiment, you may wonder? Well, we don't, unfortunately, we don't have any photographs of the actual experiment. We don't have any film. Some of you may have seen post-war reconstructions that are kind of amusing to watch. We do have a few pictures from afterwards, of course. We have these charcoal renderings. You can see one of them on the screen there in the bottom left to try and capture kind of the flavor for the room, what it was like to be there. Now, I asked, I knew Harold Agnew. You can see the arrow on the screen there is pointing at Harold Agnew, who is one of Enrico Fermi's students. Some of you, if any of you have been at the laboratory for a while, maybe you've seen Harold give a talk. He used to come back periodically before he passed away in 2013. During one of those talks, someone asked Harold, well, what was it like to be there for this experiment? And um, and Harold gave a kind of an interesting answer. By the way, if you would like to see it yourself, I have a personal YouTube page. I forgot if I mentioned this in the talk yesterday or not, but I have a personal YouTube page. There are over 50 laboratory videos on it now, including 3 lectures by Harold. So you can hear him answer this or talk about this story if you'd rather hear it directly from him. But when asked what it was like to be in the room, Harold said, well, these people who talk about, ooh, we changed the world and everything. He said, that's a bunch of baloney. And then went on to say, I just thought, well, this is another one of Fermi's experiments, and it worked. And I had no reason to doubt that it wasn't going to work, and I just went back to work. So you get the dramatic charcoal renderings on the one hand, but then you get Harold's account of what it's like to be in the room for the other. And again, let me strongly encourage you to go watch Harold's talks that he gave. He was a fascinating person, went on to be the third director of the laboratory, okay? And the story of the laboratory when he was the director in the 1970s, hopefully we can do that talk one of these days as well. But anyway, Harold went on to film the attack on Hiroshima. He was there in the trailing plane, the observation plane. Did some very interesting work. He worked for Louis Alvarez, who did we meet Louis last time or not? I think we're going to meet Louis today. But anyway, why don't we move things ahead by talking about Axis nuclear weapons programs for just a moment? I did get a question yesterday about Axis nuclear weapons programs, particularly the German program, and why it was not successful. And so, if you want to ask me about that during Q&A, that would be a potential question for you, and I'll give you my best shot at an answer. But at this point in time, we didn't know where the Germans or the Japanese were. Now, remember, these two major Axis countries have nuclear weapons programs. We're particularly concerned with the Germans for reasons that we talked about yesterday. Remember, they produced fission first. They've got a lot of great scientists, a heritage of many scientific fields there in Germany. We're very concerned about them. We're going to talk about how concerned on the next slide, but very little is known about what's going on there. And I think that that's really for 2 reasons. For one thing, I don't, at least to my knowledge, I don't think we were even looking in Japan, where there was a pretty small scale program. As far as Germany goes, number one, I don't think that we had an awful lot of intelligence assets on the ground. And of course, this work would have been conducted in absolute secrecy as well. But maybe the main reason that we didn't find anything out about the German program during the war, or at least not very much, is that there just wasn't that much to find. As to where the Manhattan Project was, as we saw yesterday, this enormous national, even international effort with sites all over the United States and as many as 500,000 people working on it at one point or another, there just wasn't anything even close to that scale going on in Germany to find. Okay, but again, we didn't know where the Germans were, and that can be quite worrisome because remember, yesterday we talked about that question: where are the Germans? This is the question that was on people's minds during the Manhattan Project that was driving them along. So let's continue this story a little bit. We'll try to move up to our next slide and talk about some interesting work that we did during the war that it seems not a lot of people know very much about. Now, we've been in the threat reduction global security business for a very, very long time at the laboratory, going back at least to the spring of 1944, as you'll see in these documents. Just want to touch on these really quickly, but we have been analyzing foreign threats for a very long time. So put yourself in the shoes of the federal government. You're concerned about what the Germans are up to. Where is their clandestine nuclear weapons laboratory? Well, who better than your own clandestine nuclear weapons laboratory than to try and help you track down the enemy's clandestine nuclear weapons laboratory? And so, anyway, the government sends us our first intelligence taskings in the spring of 1944. And there's Louis. I mentioned him a moment ago. He was Harold Agnew's boss during World War II. Louis is going to respond to some of these intelligence taskings. Now, Louis had an interesting career. He was in charge of the detonator program at Los Alamos. He was in charge of developing diagnostics to measure the blast of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Again, Harold helped him with that. After the war, he won a Nobel Prize, completely unrelated to any of that, as far as I can tell. He also co-postulated the asteroid impact theory for the extinction of dinosaurs with his son, Walter, and also responded to wartime intelligence taskings. And so if you're interested in reading these, I can send them to you, and you can share them with whoever you would like because we recently had them LAU-art, so they are publicly releasable. Louis writes back and he basically says, look, what we'll do, we'll send somebody into Switzerland. I had a question about Switzerland yesterday as well. We'll send somebody into Switzerland, which is neutral. They can pose like they're going on a fishing trip. They'll go out on Lake Constance where the Rhine River empties out. They'll take their picnic lunch with them, have a bottle of water there, drink the water, casually dip it down into the lake there, get a water sample, go back to Switzerland to the shore. We'll put that water in the diplomatic pouch and have it sent back to the laboratory to have it monitored. And of course, we want to do that as quickly as possible because if there are any German fission products in there to detect, we want to detect them before they go away. Some of these things have very short half-lives, of course. And so isn't that interesting that the guy in charge of the detonator program, among other things, is also proposing this James Bond type stuff. Again, those documents are available. Just send me an email and I will send them to you to review. Another interesting thing is that Los Alamos may, I say may, have inadvertently come up with the concept for the dirty bomb. And it was inadvertently proposed by Captain Parsons. You can see Captain Parsons there on the screen. He went by the nickname Deke Parsons. He was again, a Navy captain. There were only, in the second half of World War II, we had two associate directors. One of them was Enrico Fermi, who we just met. The other one was Deke Parsons. And so he's way up there. He reports directly to Oppenheimer. He's in charge of the gun program also and arms Little Boy in flight on its way to Hiroshima. So both of these guys had really interesting wartime careers and well beyond the war as well. But anyway, he's concerned that the Germans may take some conventional artillery and lace it or an unmanned aircraft as you see out there on the screen and lace it with radioactive poison. So today we would refer to that as a dirty bomb. He thought that the Germans might come up with this idea, and fortunately, again to my knowledge at least, they didn't. Fortunately our guy did, but not a lot of people know that these types of things were going on at that time, and we continue to do work in this very general area even to this day at the laboratory. So let's talk about weapons design at the publicly releasable level. Sound okay to everyone? Now, in the beginning, I should mention, some of you may have seen last week that we published a short article on where the name the gadget came from. And if you want to take a look at that, we did a revision. By the way, I should thank Bill Archer. He found a little bit of information that was quite useful that we added. And so we've updated that article since then. I mention that because these names like Gadget, Little Boy, Thin Man, Fat Man, I'm going to make it sound a lot more clear than it actually was at the time because you can see these names as you go through the correspondence and they kind of jump around and are generic. I think that we had a couple of at least cases that were called like Fat Boys. I mean, it's kind of confusing. So I'm going to kind of boil it down and get it as close to accurate as I can. And so bear with me here. In the beginning, the main weapon of the war was called Thin Man. Not too many people have heard of Thin Man before because it didn't work, okay? So it never went into combat, but it's going to be our main weapon for two reasons. First of all, it's going to use plutonium. Remember yesterday we were talking about producing plutonium, enriching uranium. Thin Man is going to use plutonium, which is a much more efficient material to use in your nuclear weapon. So we like it for that reason. We also like it because it's a gun-assembled nuclear weapon, and gun-assembled nuclear weapons from an engineering standpoint are pretty straightforward. Those of you who have clearances can come visit me over at the National Security Research Center, and you can see wartime produced classified drawings of Little Boy, Fat Man, and many other interesting things as well, if you would like to check it out. In a gun-assembled nuclear weapon, we're going to take one subcritical massive fissile material. We're going to shoot it at another subcritical fissile massive material, and we're going to get a nuclear detonation. Sounds pretty straightforward, and that's why they liked it. So from an engineering standpoint, we like Thin Man, we like the gun concept, and we like that it uses plutonium. Now, our backup plan, we're going to call Little Boy. I think it took a little while for the name to appear, but for our discussion today, we're going to call it Little Boy. It too is a gun-assembled nuclear weapon, and you've probably heard about it before because it did enter combat against Hiroshima. We'll talk about that in just a little while. But anyway, Little Boy also is a gun-assembled nuclear weapon, but it uses enriched uranium. The reason that we don't like it as much, the reason why it's the backup plan, is because enriching uranium is really, really difficult, and you're probably going to need quite a bit of it for one of these to work. Okay, so we've got Thin Man, we've got Little Boy, and we've got a year that's going to pass between our Primer Conference. Remember, the first major technical conference is held in April 1943. Now we're into the spring of 1944, and we have another Italian Nobel laureate at the laboratory. His name is Emilio Segre, who is tasked with performing experiments on the plutonium to ensure that it will work in a gun-assembled nuclear weapons. As his experimental results start to come in, they are troubling because it looks like we may have a problem. Now, we need neutrons for a nuclear weapon, of course, but can you have too much of a good thing? And so some of the isotopes of plutonium that we're producing are emitting an abundance of neutrons, maybe more than we want, that are causing a problem that's going to be known as pre-initiation or pre-detonation. Because there's so many neutrons that are already in flux with both the projectile and the target. Remember, the secret to a nuclear weapon, we want to hold it together long enough for it to produce a full-scale nuclear explosion. Segre's experiments show that, well, it may not work. The bomb may pre-initiate. It may pre-detonate before it fully assembles because of all these neutrons that are in flux. If that happens, it's going to be a fizzle, and we're not going to have a nuclear weapon. And so, anyway, they perform more and more experiments into the fall, or I should say, into the late spring and into the early summer of 1944, before they finally confirmed that plutonium's just not going to work in this type of assembly. So we've lost Thin Man, and this is a problem because Thin Man was the main bomb. It was the one that we had some hope of having a production capability for because you didn't need as much material for it because remember, the plutonium is more efficient. Now we're down to Little Boy, and Little Boy by itself, remember, not very efficient. It's going to consume a lot of material, and so you're probably not going to be able to put these into combat very regularly. It's may even be just kind of a one-off gimmick. If we want to show the enemy that we have a novel new capability, we're going to need to figure out a way to make plutonium work. And so, on August 14th, 1944, Oppenheimer formally reorganizes the laboratory. I like to point that date out because exactly 1 year later to the day, the Emperor of Japan announced his people over the radio and announced the armistice, the end of fighting. Now think about that for a moment. We're going to reorganize the laboratory to build an entirely new, different type of weapon for the plutonium. And a year later, it's been successfully tested and put into combat. That's pretty remarkable when you stop and you think about it for just a moment. And so anyway, we're going to have multiple new divisions that come out of this reorg, which continues on even today and perpetuates. We're going to have the two new main divisions that are created are going to be X Division. Okay, X back then stood for explosives. We're going to have an entire new division that's dedicated totally dedicated just to looking at high explosives. And we're going to have G division, which stood for gadget. Okay, so that is our code name for, it's kind of a generic code name for nuclear weapons, but usually applied to the imploding bomb. And we'll talk about the architecture of an imploding bomb in just a moment. But anyway, the gadget division is more formally known as weapons physics. So they're going to do the physics. So we've got a new physics division to look at this, and we have the explosives division. Now, what we're going to do, instead of having a gun where we fire bits of material at each other, we're going to take a sphere of plutonium. We're going to surround it with thousands of pounds of high explosives. We're going to embed detonators into the high explosives. Once the bomb reaches a certain altitude, proximity fuses will tell the detonator or the fire set to tell the detonators to go off. The detonators will go off at the same time. Ignite the high explosives. The high explosives will compress the plutonium pit, and we will have a nuclear detonation. This is a little bit more complicated than our gun. We've been thinking about possibly using implosion for quite a while, but it was just a sideshow until the summer of 1944. Now it's going to be kind of the main thrust of the research at the laboratory. Oppenheimer basically says, look, we have to do this. We have to do it fast, we have to do it well, and we have to do it without compromising the gun program, or Little Boy, as we mentioned before. So we start doing a lot of experiments, a lot of high explosives experiments in the fall of 1944, major experiments to try and understand the hydrodynamics of implosion. Now, this leads into one of the main problems with an imploding type bomb. The weaponized version of it, we are going to call Fat Man, and you all heard of Fat Man before. Number one is we don't have a lot of exotic, super duper safe high explosives compounds because they've not been invented by the laboratory yet. Of course, Los Alamos and Livermore have invented some really great forms of high explosive. We're going to have to use the off-the-shelf stuff in World War II. The other issue is that, remember, explosives are supposed to expand, releasing energy, hence the name explosives. They're not called implosives. So we're going to take an off-the-shelf product and try and make it do the exact opposite thing that it was originally intended for. So that's going to be a challenge. Developing the detonator, remember that's Louis's job. That's going to be a problem. Developing the circuits to fire the detonators, that's going to be another problem. That's going to be an X division. There's just a lot of issues, and we don't have much time. We don't know if the Germans could, again, have a nuclear weapon tomorrow. Now, fortunately, as we start doing implosion tests at the laboratory, we learn a lot more about this type of weapon, and our confidence starts to grow. This thing might actually work. But at no point did scientists have enough confidence to put it into combat untested. Now, fortunately, just as Segre was starting to discover that we might have a problem with plutonium in a gun, we started looking for a test site. And so a Harvard physicist named Kenneth Bainbridge was given this job. He quickly becomes not just the guy looking for a spot, but becomes the director of the test. We're going to talk about Trinity in just a moment, but before we do, I want you to think about this for just a second. Nobody's ever at this point done something like this before. I've got a 2-hour talk just on Trinity. If you want to hear it one of these days, we'll do another two-parter. But every aspect of the world's first nuclear test was unprecedented. And that in and of itself makes it perhaps another candidate for world's greatest single scientific experiment. Again, you can debate in chat. I think I saw my buddy Alan Hurd made a comment there in chat. I hope Alan's here. I haven't seen Alan lately. Hope he's doing well. But anyway, debate amongst yourselves. Is the Manhattan Project now responsible for 2 of the top 5 greatest science experiments ever conducted? We'll see what you think there. But let's go on and talk about the Trinity test for just a moment. We don't have a lot of time to talk about Trinity because we have to cover this and we have to cover the end of the war as well, and we've only got about 35 minutes left. And so I would, hey, it is Alan. Excellent. So if you're interested in Trinity, as I mentioned, I do have a talk with many slides on Trinity. I've also just written an article that's going to be published later this year on the Trinity test. It has a lot of information in it pertaining to fallout. And so if you are interested in the downwind situation after Trinity, I was able to work with the original documents, the recordings of radiation levels at certain points, handwritten stuff that is in your National Security Research Center. So if you'd like to learn more about that, there is a full section in the paper just dealing with the fallout issue. You might have questions during Q&A for me, and I will do my best to answer them as a historian, not as a health physicist, although I'm grateful to all of the health physicists who helped me in putting that paper together. So let's talk about Trinity. Before we do, actually, let's talk about Little Boy a bit more. The scientists were nearly certain that Little Boy was going to work. They were beyond confident. Now, maybe you've heard before that Little Boy entered combat without a full-scale test. That is true, but Little Boy did not go into combat without being tested at a lower level. All kinds of tests were performed on Little Boy here at the laboratory. Every component of Little Boy was rigorously tested before it went into combat here at the laboratory. Criticality testing basically verified that it was going to work. There was essentially no way it was not going to work. So we're not going to say that they were certain, because there's only one way to be certain. But they were all but certain that Little Boy was going to work. And plus, it's not like we have enough material laying around to have a test device and then put one into combat, then maybe you have to make another one. Little Boy is just that. It's the only one that we have. So it's going to go into combat without that full-scale nuclear test. But as we were talking about, the more complex imploding device, which we had such little time to work on, we're going to want to do a test of that first. And fortunately, because it is much more efficient, we can test it and then we can put one into combat. And we can put more into combat if necessary. I'll have some production numbers for you later. If I forget, remind me in chat if you want to know how many more Fat Men could have gone into combat against Japan going into the fall. Now, here's a trivia question for you. Oh, well, actually, I added a bullet on here, so I gave away the question. I was going to ask, where is the German program in the days leading up to Trinity? If you've read the slides already, you know that it is kaput. Nazi Germany no longer exists by the time Trinity is conducted. But anyway, just preparing the test site, choosing the test site, all of these were very difficult challenges, time-consuming challenges. Ultimately, it's decided that we're going to perform this test at what is today the White Sands Missile Range. I didn't realize this until just a few weeks ago, but as to where the Nevada test site is about the size of Rhode Island, I think that it's a little bit larger than the state of Rhode Island. I think that White Sands is the size of Rhode Island and Delaware. So fact check me on that, but that is your fun, I think I'm right fact of the presentation today. Pretty big place, and it is acquired by the government in 1942 as a bombing range where bomber pilots can learn how to bomb things, and hence it is known back then as the Alamogordo Bombing Range. I would like to note, often the town of Alamogordo is associated with Trinity, and I think that's because it was the name of the base. Alamogordo, remember how big White Sands is, the Alamogordo Bombing Range. The main gate is near Alamogordo. The test site, ground zero for Trinity, was actually a long ways from there. It was much closer to the towns of San Antonio, New Mexico, and Socorro, if you're familiar with our geography here. So anyway, just another little tidbit for you there. But anyway, the land already is owned by the government, so at least the Manhattan Project's not going to have to evict anybody in this case. And also, it's not that far from Los Alamos. Multiple sites were considered in the state of California, in the state of Texas, a couple of sites in Colorado as well. But anyway, for the reasons that we talked about, we're going to do this test south of Los Alamos at the bombing range. Now, before we set off, or hope, because remember, it might not work, before we do the full-scale test, maybe we should do some practice. And so there are a couple of rehearsals for Trinity. The first major rehearsal is conducted on May 7th, 1945. As you can see there on the screen, they take approximately 100 tons of TNT. You can see a picture of it over there stacked on the left. We've got some really nice color footage as well from Trinity. You can see a lot of original Trinity footage, again, at my personal YouTube page, if you would like to check that out. If you can't find it on your own, I'd be happy to send you the link. But anyway, you can see the 100-ton test there. The idea here is, A, we want to make sure that all of our diagnostic instruments are calibrated correctly. And also, we have some nice pictures of this. We want to find out more about fallout. And so Hanford is going to send us a highly irradiated slug. We're going to dissolve it at the Trinity site, and then we're going to pump it into tubes that have been laced into the high explosives there that you see stacked up there on the left. So when we blow this stuff up, we'll see how we did. Well, how did they do? Well, in terms of diagnostics, the many of the diagnostics were a quarter second off, and that may not sound like much, but when you are trying to record early fireball phenomena, Quarter second is, well, you've kind of lost most of the show there. And so that was a big correction that was needed. In terms of fallout, they discovered, because of the irradiated material that had been thrown into the air, first of all, they discovered that a lot more of that irradiated material was thrown up into the air than they were initially expecting. And so fallout could be a bigger problem than was originally anticipated. And so they get together an evacuation detachment just in case people downwind need to be evacuated. That didn't happen. You can read more about that in my paper. But anyway, they did prepare for an evacuation, and they further developed the safety plan that they were already working on. Okay, so that is the 100-ton test, the rehearsal test. And as you saw on the screen there, of course, Nazi Germany formally surrenders about 9 hours before the test. So you might be asking yourself the question at this point, okay, so Germany's out of the war. Who's left? Italy's out, Germany's out, so Japan. Japan against the world. Japan against the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain. Who do you think's going to win the war? Pretty obvious, right? And so why did the Japanese continue to fight? We'll talk about that in a few more slides. But before we do, I'm playing a video for you now. Hopefully you can see that, and that is the 100-ton test there. If I had told you that was Trinity, I don't know. Do you think you could have told the difference there? It reminds me also of a question that you might want to ask during Q&A, because I'm not going to go through it now, but I will try and answer the question if you're interested later. Why didn't they do a demonstration first? Why didn't they set off an atomic bomb over Tokyo Bay or on top of Mount Fuji or something like that? Why didn't they do a demonstration of the bomb before they dropped it on Japanese cities? Because that idea was one that was posed, and I can talk about that later if you're interested. And remember what you just saw there with the 100-ton test, because I may allude to that in the answer uh, if the question is asked. Over there on the right, you will see the Trinity test device, the gadget. The person standing next to it there is Norris Bradbury. Norris is going to succeed J. Robert Oppenheimer as the director of the laboratory after the war's over. Our museum, as I bet you all know, is named after Norris Bradbury, the Bradbury Science Museum. Be sure and go visit. I think that they are open again, our friends over there. But Norris was the director for 25 years. And if you'd like to learn more about his quarter century as being the director, I have a talk on that as well. But anyway, he was in charge of many aspects of the Trinity test, and there he is at the top of the 100-foot steel tower from which the device was detonated. If you want to know why they tested it at the top of a 100-foot steel tower, you can ask me in Q&A, and I will try and give you the best answer I can for that. So let's see. Do we think it's going to work? Is it going to work? Let's find out. Drum roll, please. Yeah, it works. I mean, that's kind of one of the bad things about my job. It's tough to build drama into the story when you kind of already know what's going to happen. But Trinity is, of course, a success. And remember our question there, greatest scientific experiment of all time, all things considered? Yeah, maybe so. You can see that again, completely successful. This was it was detonated at 5:30 in the morning, thereabouts, July 16th, 1945. Okay, and there's a lot of story behind that. They detonated it an hour and a half after they had wanted to originally. They wanted to set it off at 4 in the morning because everybody would still be asleep, but it was raining, and they did not want to set the bomb off in the rain because if you set off an atomic bomb in the rain, all those irradiated material particles are going to be pulled back down in a concentrated pattern by the rain itself. And that's a problem because we want that irradiated material to go high into the atmosphere and disperse at entirely safe levels all over the globe over a very long time. So we have to wait for the rain, and by 5:30, guess what? A lot more people are up and about, and so they see it. Enough people see it that the Manhattan Project has to issue a press release. And in that press release, it said, hey, ammo dump at the bombing range blew up. Uh, Nobody was hurt, nothing to see here. Go on about your lives. That's basically what it said. Now, had an evacuation been necessary, they had a press release for that too. It said that an ammo dump with gas shells had blown up, and the residents of whichever area were evacuated to protect them for 48 hours or whatever it was. The exact numbers there are in my article, which again I can send you if you have any interest on that. But this is completely revolutionary. First of all, with the implosion bomb, it produces a yield, and you saw it next to Norris Bradbury on our previous slide there. Out of that ball that you saw next to Norris Bradbury, we can get 21,000 tons of TNT equivalent yield from something that small. You can put that on a plane and drop it out of a plane. There's not really much you can do to stop it if you are the enemy. The other thing is, again, this is also rapidly reproducible. So it's not just a one-off gimmick. It is a novel new capability that the United States has. You can see the quote up there, "Let there be light." You've all heard that phrase before. In this case, it was used by uh, William Lawrence, or Bill Lawrence. If you've heard of him before, New York Times reporter, did you know that the New York Times was present to cover the Trinity test? Lawrence was a future Pulitzer Prize winner. He was embedded in the Manhattan Project as a reporter sworn to secrecy and wrote articles on things like Trinity, the end of the war, J. Robert Oppenheimer, General Groves, to be released after the combat use of the first atomic bomb. And so anyway, he was known for kind of his hyperbole and over the top. It's interesting to read some of his work, and anyway, he uses that phrase, "Let there be light." Before we leave this phrase, you can see the fireball expanding there in the pictures over on your left. We have a lot of pictures of Trinity. I mentioned you can see the film on my personal YouTube page. I think that we have, well, I know that we have hundreds of publicly releasable images of Trinity. And if you would like them, send me an email, and me and our image archivist can help you out. Photo over on the right is the only good color photo that exists of the Trinity test. It was taken by Jack Abbey, and he was one of Emilio Segre's technicians. But anyway, pretty striking image of the Trinity test there, I would say. So what did it do? Well, why don't we talk, and let me see what I've got on my next slide here. I'm going to, I know we don't have time, but I'm going to play this for you anyway, because I want you to hear Oppenheimer himself reflecting on the Trinity test. Some of you may have seen the footage before that I'm about to show you. It's going to run about a minute. He's going to be talking about the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture. He's going to talk about Vishnu and how the god of war, the Hindu god of war, is taking on his multi-armed form, trying to persuade the prince to do his duty. And Oppenheimer will say, well, I guess we all felt that way in one way or another. Oppenheimer is not referring to himself as the multi-armed Hindu god of war. He's referring to himself as the prince who is reluctant to do his duty. The prince is not excited about going to war. Would you? Would you be excited about dropping an atomic bomb even on your worst enemy? Oppenheimer, maybe as much as anyone else in the world, knew what was going to happen when the atomic bombs were used in combat. He's not very excited about it. I don't think he ever regretted the decision, but maybe he did regret that physics, that the laws of nature made such a weapon possible. But I think he recognized this is probably the best of a series of bad options that are available. So let's watch him talking about Trinity together.
He knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Right, and many great reactions from Trinity. If you're interested in those, again, they're covered in my paper as well. Let's see what it actually did here. These are some pictures of the area after test. The blast, of course, vaporized most of the device's 100-foot steel tower, and I say most because the further down the tower you get, the less vaporization that you have and more shattering. There's still tiny shards of the Trinity Tower, I've been told, that if you really know what you're looking for, that you can find out there. The other thing was that this was a 100-foot steel tower. It was half of a standard 200-foot radio tower. I think most of the cell phone towers that you see around are 200-foot towers. That was the same height as radar towers as well. And so they take the bottom half, use it for this. There's reinforced concrete footings holding this tower in place that are underground. And so the fireball comes in contact with the ground immediately. By the way, that does not happen at Hiroshima and Nagasaki because the bombs are detonated at a much higher altitude. The fireball scoops up hundreds of tons of earth, exposing the reinforced concrete footings that had been underground. And that's what you see Oppenheimer and his boss, General Groves, standing next to there on the right. I should mention as well, this was from a September press visit to the Trinity site. So only a couple of months after Trinity. We do have an account of that. If you would like to learn more about that visit, we actually have estimates of how much radiation people who were there received. You might be concerned for General Groves and Oppenheimer there, but no need to, because as you will note, General Groves has his safety booties on his feet there. So everything is fine, nothing to worry about there. But that gives you an idea of how powerful this was. The bomb created a shallow crater. I think it was 5 feet deep by 30 feet wide, something like that. But anyway, immensely powerful. By the way, all of that earth that was scooped up into the fireball, the lighter particles went up into the atmosphere, is in the form of smoke. The heavier particles were molten sand, basically, and they rained back down to the earth. And when they reached the ground, they re-solidified into a greenish glass-like substance that we now call trinitite. Trinitite, you can find it floating around. We have a nice display over at the Bradbury Science Museum. If you decide, hey, I'd like some of that trinitite for my personal collection of nuclear era history stuff, the only place I would buy some from is from the what is it down there in Albuquerque? The Museum of Nuclear Science and Technology, I believe. Somebody will correct me if I've got that wrong and put a link in the chat. Great museum. I highly recommend it. But they do have some pieces of trinitite if you would like that. Before we leave this slide, you'll look down there. You see our comparison between the 100-ton test location and the Trinity test location. See the little black dot that the arrow on the right is pointing to? It took 100 tons of TNT just to make that little black dot. Over to the left, we see the sea of trinitite that was created by the melted desert sand. It only took, and this is the official publicly releasable number by DOE, only about 13.5 pounds of plutonium to do that. Pretty remarkable stuff. So let's talk about the end of the war with our remaining time. We've got about 16, 17 minutes to go, and then of course we will do Q&A as long as you would like. After that, the initial goal of the Manhattan Project was to beat Hitler in a race to build an atomic bomb. Well, Hitler's dead. He shot himself back on April 30th, more than 2 months before Trinity. So now what? Well, now Japan continues to fight. And so I would like to point out, as we get into the discussion about the decision, if you will, to use atomic bombs at the end of the war, the laboratory doesn't make policy. We've never made policy. We make technology to give policymakers options. And that was the case here as well. So we want to try and complete this technology as quickly as possible to give policymakers an option for trying to help bring the war with Japan to an end. Now, those reasons why Japan kept fighting. First of all, Japan had never lost a war before, ever. They are like undefeated in war. How do you lose a war? Well, the Japanese had never known what that was like. So that's a little bit of a problem. A bigger problem, though, is it's considered culturally dishonorable to surrender. Now, remember our discussion yesterday when we talked about the expansion of the co-prosperity sphere? For decades at that point in time, Imperial Japan had been fighting, conquering, expanding borders, all of this other stuff. This was a nation that was very much addicted to war at that point in time, years and decades. And as part of your being raised in that culture at that point in time, you're told, especially you go into the military, you don't surrender. It is better for you to die in a bayonet charge than it is for you to surrender. Because if you surrender, it will be personally and permanently dishonorable to you, your family, and your nation. Now, can you imagine your nation that's taught you that your entire life, turning around and surrendering the country and allowing it to be occupied by foreigners for the first time ever? It was beyond unacceptable. This was unimaginable to people in Japan, especially the military. And so that's going to be a big problem, trying to get the Japanese to surrender versus just dying fighting to the last person. That's going to be an issue as well. Another thing is that Japan, remember, they wanted to win the war, basically, at Pearl Harbor. They're in this long, protracted war that they weren't planning on. Don't you know they wanted out? And they had been trying to negotiate their way out of the war for months at this point in time. They had been negotiating with the Soviet Union. The Soviets, of course, were an ally that they were not at war against. They had a non-aggression pact signed with the Soviets. But here's the problem, if you've heard that before. They wanted to dictate the terms. And the terms were basically, okay, look, let's stop fighting. We're not going to call it a surrender. You're going to promise that we can keep the emperor. You're going to let us have all the land that's still under our occupation. You're not going to occupy the home islands. You're not going to try us for war crimes. In short, yeah, the Japanese wanted to end this train wreck that they had started, but they wanted to dictate the terms. And of course, that was entirely unacceptable to the Allies. The objective of the war in the Pacific was to destroy Imperial Japan. We're not going to let Japan dictate terms to us. Can you imagine the West making a similar deal with the Nazis? Oh, yeah, we can stop fighting now. You can keep the land you still have under your occupation. You can keep the Fuhrer. I mean, it's just totally unthinkable. So if you're Japan, okay, so you're not going to give us the 5, 6 terms that we want. What's the best way to extract a few of those terms from your enemy? Inflict pain. And so the Japanese are going to do that. They're going to inflict pain as much as they can at places like Saipan, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. They're going to fight almost literally to the last man in some of these engagements. Again, because that's the culturally acceptable thing to do, but also because they want to hurt the Allies in hopes that the Allies will say, well, look, if you'll just, we're going to win. We know that. We don't want to fight you anymore. We'll let you keep the emperor and not try you for war crimes. What do you say? This was the hope of the Japanese, was that they could inflict enough pain to cut some kind of deal that would allow them to get out of the war on terms that they considered to be acceptable. Meanwhile, in Washington, I don't think that there's really a debate over whether to use atomic bombs or not. I like Bart Bernstein's quote. Bart is a historian of this business as well. And I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically said, the decision to use atomic bombs was not so much a decision, so much as it was the implementation of an assumption. You've got a new capability, of course you're going to try it. And we're going to talk about that coming up very shortly here. But if there was a debate in Washington, it had less to do with whether they should be used or not, and more to do with, well, should we give the Japanese some terms? Should we promise the Japanese that they could keep the emperor? This really turned out to be a sticking point in the debate. But ultimately it was decided, no, we're not going to guarantee anything. We'll talk about the terms that were agreed upon at the end of the talk today. The surrender was unconditional, but that was what the debate was over. Should it be unconditional surrender that we demand or not? If you've looked ahead on the slide already, you can see many of the cities that were considered for atomic bombing. Imperial Japan survived most of World War II largely intact because there was no place to effectively bomb Japan from. It's surrounded by a lot of water. The Soviet Union, who they've got a non-aggression pact with, the only way to bomb Japan for a long time was basically out of China. So you would ship supplies over the Himalayas on an improvised road. It didn't work out too well, but when we captured Tinian and Saipan, now we could launch hundreds of planes against Japanese targets. And so it wasn't until late in 1944, early 1945, that these bombing raids commenced. And when they commenced, the Japanese people, for the first time, saw war in a major way. And the end came swiftly and violently. Okay, and so that is what's going on. So since many of the cities are still intact, the Manhattan Project requests that some of these cities remain intact. Because, again, one of the reasons why you would not want to do a demonstration first, well, destroying nothing is not very impressive. Destroying an already city is not very impressive either. Okay, and so anyway, the Manhattan Project wanted to take a healthy, thriving city that was contributing to the war effort and basically annihilate it in a minute. Now that leaves an impression. And so again, you can see the cities that were considered below. For those of you who know about Japan, you might be surprised that Kyoto was considered there, not a military base. Actually, that's where some of the, not, I don't think we knew it at the time, but that's where some of the Japanese atomic research was going on, but not a military target, but it was a psychological target. And for sure, these were very much weapons of psychology, not just death and destruction. General Groves wanted to bomb Kyoto, and the reason why, again, not really a military target, but a cultural center, a center of art and history and religion. General Groves basically wanted to send the message that, hey, nothing is sacred. We will not only destroy your people, we will destroy your heritage, your history, if you don't surrender. Now, the Secretary of War, Stimson, he stepped in and said, no, we're not going to bomb Kyoto because it has no military value. Plus, I spent my honeymoon there. I'm kind of might want to go back someday. Don't know if he said that in the meeting, but there is an article on this subject called Mr. Stimson's Pet City, and I could send you that if you would like to read a copy of it. But anyway, we're going to look very carefully at Hiroshima, Nagasaki. We'll talk about in a moment, Kokura, and let's see what happens. We're down to 10 minutes now, it looks like. As I mentioned before, you can see that psychological considerations were considered. We talked about that. In terms of the use of the weapons themselves, you might be wondering, for instance, back in March of 1945, we sent a bombing raid to Tokyo. One bombing raid killed 100,000 people, and it left 1 million people homeless, just using incendiary conventional ordnance. So we were pretty good at the whole death and destruction thing already. So you might be wondering, what's the difference between sending 300 or 500 planes to a city and one plane with an atomic bomb? You might be thinking, well, radiological poisoning and things like that. But there's more to it than that. And I think I mentioned this earlier. If I send 500 planes to your city, there are countermeasures for that. For instance, you can sound the alarms and get your people to hide. In fact, we had already dropped millions and millions of leaflets on Imperial Japan telling the people of their cities to leave. I think that one of the phrases that was used was, bombs don't have eyes. We don't want to kill innocent civilians. But these are production centers. And if you're going to continue producing things to kill our people, we're going to continue to bomb these places. So get out if you're not contributing to the war effort. A lot of people had already left these cities before. Get a sip of water. So that's one thing. You can send your people out of the city. You can scramble the fighters. And Japan didn't have many good fighter pilots left. Most of them had already been killed, but they did have a lot of planes available and people ready to ram them into a ship to try and break the blockade, or into a bomber, things like that. Also, you've got a lot of anti-aircraft guns. In short, you can effectively kill lots of Americans because of the countermeasures that exist and protect your people to some extent. You can fight back, even if it's not very successful. Now, what about an atomic bomb? What are the countermeasures for an atomic bomb in 1945? Non-existent. This is an irresistible new weapon. There is no way to fight back. And I think that that left a pretty significant mark on the military leadership in Japan. There is no way to fight back. There's not going to be a great, glorious final battle because we're just going to get nuked now. Now, more on that later, but this really is a big deal that the United States, with help from the United Kingdom, as we talked about, has developed this new weapon. I think one of the reasons why there was not much of a decision is, I mean, put yourself in the position of the President of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt has passed away now. We have a new president, President Truman. We have defeated the Japanese in battle after battle for years with a fraction of our forces. Now we can bring the rest of our forces, the bulk of our forces from Europe, throw them at the Japanese as well. This didn't induce the Japanese to surrender. We've taken Okinawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. The Japanese have chosen not to surrender. We're bombing their cities one by one. The Japanese have chosen not to surrender. We killed 100,000 people in Tokyo in one bombing raid. The Japanese have chosen not to surrender. After Trinity, the president warned the Japanese. He said, "You will surrender unconditionally or you will face prompt and utter destruction." The warning did not produce the desired outcome that was hoped for either. What would you do if you're the president? Every bombing raid that you send to Japan, if you send 500 planes there, you're putting 5,000 Americans in harm's way. Kids that you're responsible for. Now you've got an irresistible weapon that can cause maybe at least as much damage. Which would you choose if you're in that position? I think that initially President Truman was pretty excited about having this new capability. His tune is going to change, though, a little bit as time advances, especially after the Nagasaki strike. But anyway, we're hoping that these weapons of psychology will help convince the Japanese that, look, we know you're going to lose, you know you're going to lose, but now you're not even going to get to fight back. So we're hoping that that will help bring hostilities to an end. So our first strike is going to be launched against the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Now, I still hear from time to time people say that Hiroshima was not a military target. I don't know if there's like an official definition for what constitutes a military target out there, but by my definition, it is the definition of a military target. For instance, you can see in the first bullet there, an important it's got an important Army headquarters there. In fact, that was, I believe, the target, the headquarters in the middle of town for the bombing raid. We can place 30,769 Army soldiers in the city at the time of bombing. Now, I don't know about you, but 31,000 Army soldiers in a concentrated area sounds like a pretty good military target to me, but that's just me. And it doesn't end there. Also, you'll remember from yesterday, we've got thousands of Korean forced laborers who have been brought in to do what? To contribute to the war effort, to fortify the cities of southern Japan. So we've got a city that's being fortified with over 30,000 soldiers in it. And there's more. Hiroshima was also an important port as well. I've not been able to find the figure for the number of sailors who was there, but that number would have been in the thousands, I'm guessing, as well. So, at least by my definition, Hiroshima was an ideal military target, and that is why it was selected. We're going to use Little Boy in this attack, the gun-assembled enriched uranium weapon, the only one that we have available, and it is going to be delivered aboard the B-29 Enola Gay. The plane is named after the pilot's mother, and so the pilot of the plane is Colonel Paul Tibbets. You can see Tibbets and his crew there on the left. Tibbets is standing second from your right. And anyway, he named it after Mom. He wanted to make sure that no other plane in the fleet had the same name as his plane. You can see a picture of the Little Boy combat unit there in the middle of the screen. So what happens? Well, it works. This mission goes according to plan. Everything is perfect. August 6, 1945, as many people in Hiroshima were preparing their breakfasts over open flames, Little Boy is dropped over the center of the city. As I mentioned before, the fireball does not come in contact with the surface. But it starts many fires down below. If you've heard of thousands of people being instantly vaporized in the atomic attacks, that didn't happen. That would have been better compared to what actually did happen. Many people were burned alive very quickly. And as I mentioned before, as people were cooking their meals over open flames, their houses were collapsed by the shock wave. The fires continued to spread. Many people suffocated or burned alive in their own house. It was an awful way to go. I would strongly encourage you as we talk about numbers here, and I give you kind of the clinical version of this story. Please read John Hersey's 1946 essay, Hiroshima. Hersey was a journalist for the New Yorker. He went to Japan after the atomic attacks, interviewed people who were there, and put this together in his article. Read it. I mean, I think that it's a very important work, and it will give you the human side of this story to kind of counterbalance my clinical interpretation that I'm giving you today. Going back to those numbers, though, Little Boy produced a yield of 15 kilotons, so it's not as powerful as Fat Man. You'll see there when you look up fatalities and casualties from the atomic bombings, you will see numbers all over the place. I have chosen to use numbers from the 1954 U.S. Army Pathological Study because it is a credible scientific study. By mid-November of that year, 64,500 people had died as a result of one bomb going off. Mind-blowing, completely mind-blowing when you think about it. We talked about the Koreans. Also, around 10 American POWs died in the attack as well. That one bomb destroyed 5 square miles of the city. And unfortunately, the Japanese chose not to surrender at that point in time. Of course, as you might imagine, things were pretty chaotic in Japan at that point as well. But the Japanese continue fighting back in essence. Now, remember that non-aggression pact that the Japanese had with the Soviet Union? Well, the Soviet Union is going to break that non-aggression pact. They're not going to help the Japanese try and bring the war to an end on Japanese terms anymore. They're going to declare war on the Japanese very late in the night of August 8th. Right after the declaration of war was announced, Manchuria was invaded in the opening moments of August 9th, 1945. You can see that the Soviet Union surrounds Manchuria on 3 sides. And so the Red Army came in, and according to Soviet numbers, 84,000 Japanese soldiers died in the brief campaign that ensued. And so this was a diplomatic disaster for the Japanese because, again, they were trying to negotiate a peace settlement with the Soviet Union, but it's also a military catastrophe, as the numbers will bear out. And you could see the Emperor of Japan making what I would consider to be a pretty significant understatement there in the quote over on the left. I don't know. Do you think that the very foundation of the empire's existence is already at risk? Yeah, they're in pretty bad shape. And so the Soviet entry into the war was also a significant blow to the Japanese in the final days of the war. August 9th is only going to get worse for the Japanese because around, I think it was around 11 in the morning, so about 11 hours later, approximately after the invasion started, we're going to have our second atomic strike. Now, the original target was the city of Kokura. Kokura was home to one of the largest military arsenals in Japan. That is why it was selected. Nagasaki was the backup target for each of the atomic strikes. Now, this time we're going to have a different plane, a different pilot, a different type of bomb, and we're going to hope for the same outcome. And ultimately, we will get it, although, as you can see on this slide, this turns out to be a much more problematic mission. The plane has mechanical problems, there are weather problems. They were under orders to visually acquire the target. When they flew to Kokura, an armed fat man, they made multiple passes over the city but could not deploy the bomb because it was too cloudy and they could not acquire the target. So your lucky day if you lived in Kokura at that point in time. Unfortunately, though, if you lived in Nagasaki, it was going to be a pretty bad day there. They go to Nagasaki. There's enough of an opening in the clouds for them to acquire the city below. They drop the Fat Man unit out of the plane, and it detonates on the outskirts of town, directly over the Mitsubishi War Armaments factory. Now, this factory really was a factory complex with multiple smaller factories within it. You can see pictures of it there over on the left-hand side, left center. You can see the factories in the distance. You can see the smokestacks. The picture over on the right is close-up of the factory complex there. Among other things, we think that these factories manufactured, ironically, the torpedoes that were used in the attack on Pearl Harbor. So this attack turns out to be to go pretty well because it completely obliterates the war-making capability of Nagasaki, but fewer civilians are killed. And you'll notice there, although the yield is pretty significantly greater than Little Boy at 21 kilotons there, fewer people die. That's because of where the bomb went off. Remember, this bomb goes off on the outskirts of town over the Mitsubishi plant, as opposed to Little Boy, which detonated over the city center, which is where the military headquarters was. Nonetheless, though, nearly 40,000 people die as a result of this one bomb going off by mid-November of 1945, including thousands of Koreans, as well as hundreds of Chinese forced laborers as well, who had been, of course, fortifying Nagasaki. The Japanese are still not ready to surrender. Even after all of this, the sticking point is the emperor. And so anyway, they are ready to bring the war to an end, but they want a guarantee that the emperor will get to keep his position. The last piece of diplomatic correspondence that went to Japan was sent on August the 11th. Okay, we're getting several days after Hiroshima now, so quite a bit of time has passed. And you can see part of that telegram there over on the right. If you would like to see all the telegrams that I have, at least, I would be happy to email them to you. They're in a PDF document. You can read them for yourself, but you can see the back and forth between our diplomats and the Japanese diplomats as well. Now, the Japanese are told in this telegram the emperor will be expected to do this to effectuate peace. And it goes on to see to say what you see on the screen there. And as you read through that quote, does that sound like a guarantee of the emperor's position to you? It doesn't to me. In fact, it doesn't even hint at a guarantee that the Japanese emperor would get to keep his position. But it doesn't say that he will die in the hangman's noose for presiding over unimaginable war crimes. And at least by my count, the Emperor of Japan was certainly a war criminal. So the emperor wants to end the war. It is an immense struggle within Japan to try and bring the war to an end. You had people in the government who wanted to bring the war to an end. You had the military who wanted to continue to fight. I do think that the emperor played an important role in bringing the war to an end, and he was kept around. You can see him there next to General Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was the military governor of Japan after the war was over. Hirohito, the emperor, is viewed essentially as a deity. He's God. And as it turns out, when God tells his soldiers to put their guns down, that's kind of a nice thing to have there in the toolbox. And so the emperor is kept around as a puppet, and he does exactly what he is told. And in that capacity, helps make the transition to peace a lot better than it may have been otherwise. Okay, maybe it's not fair. But you know what? I think, at least, and this is subjective history. And so, guess what? You're allowed to have your own opinions. We all are on this. I think this was probably the most efficient way of bringing this horrible war to an end. We'll never know. There are other things that could have happened, but it was a terrible war. Now it's over. The peace that ensued after this was very tenuous. The armistice, as I mentioned earlier, was declared over the radio by I'm overtime, by the emperor on August 14th. There were a lot of people in Japan who were still wanting to continue the fight. Fortunately, though, that didn't happen. Now, you will hear historians and others say, atomic bombs, that was the right decision. It was the thing to do. It won the war, all this other stuff. You will hear other people say, well, atomic bombs shouldn't have been used. This was unethical. In fact, they didn't even play much of a role in getting the Japanese to surrender. You'll see people debating this stuff forever and ever and ever. Why? Because it's subjective. As you'll see on my screen there, the outcome of World War II, that is a Japanese unconditional surrender, was the product of many variables, not one thing. Because these variables are subjective, guess what? You can debate them. You can decide whatever you want. You can pick and choose the evidence that you have available to kind of push your point home, and therefore the debate is not going to weigh. I think of the end of the war kind of like making a cupcake. If you're going to have a good cupcake, you're going to need several different ingredients, which you're going to put together to produce the desired outcome, a nice cupcake. That's what World War II was. And again, it will be debated. Well, you've got atomic bombs. Did they matter or not? I think that they do. I think that they were a pretty significant ingredient. But guess what? So was the Soviet entry into the war. So were all of the conventional defeats. So were the conventional bombings. So was the blockade that was being used to strangle the Japanese home islands. There was a palace coup as all of this was going on. All of these things played at least some part in bringing the war to an end. And it came to an end formally on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. And our relationship with Japan has only gotten better since. And so anyway, you can see about a quarter of the emperor's speech there on the bottom of the screen. If you would like to read the rest of it, that too is something that I can send you if you want to send me an email reminder. But the surrender was unconditional. If you have evidence that shows that there was some kind of guarantee, backdoor guarantee, or something like that, let me know. I change my story as the evidence presents itself, but at least this is my conclusion right now. So we have not seen anything like World War II since the end of World War II. Unfortunately, some fighting has gone on at some point in some place on the planet ever since the end of World War II. But fortunately, we've not had another world war. This is what a world war looks like. The United States was lucky. We only lost about 300 Americans killed in combat every day on average. That used to be a pretty staggering number before COVID. I think with COVID, COVID's killed more Americans than World War II did. But anyway, still an impressive and sad and scary number nonetheless. But we were lucky. Look at the Soviet Union. Stalin had helped start this war, and he paid a dear price for it. 15 to 20,000 people died as a result of military action in the Soviet Union every day of World War II on average. Unbelievable. You can see some of the other numbers that I've chosen to include there as well. Go all the way down to the bottom, Chinese fatalities. Remember, co-prosperity sphere sounds like a nice place to live, doesn't it? But it wasn't. And you can ask the Koreans and the Chinese even today, and they will probably have a quick answer for you. Now, I do think that that number is high, but I do think if we ask the Chinese government today, hey, how many of your people were killed by the Japanese? I think the number that they would give us is 20 million. That may be off by a factor of 2, but even if it's a factor lower, uh, we're talking about millions of Chinese alone who were killed by the Japanese. That gives you some sense of scale of what this was like. And you'll remember yesterday when we talked about how this ancient history continues to shape policy today. I can pretty much guarantee you that this is still on the minds of the Japanese, or I should say the Chinese leadership, as they look outward from their country. I think it would do us well to remember this history as well. World War II ultimately consumed between 60 and 80 million lives worldwide. I think that the work of the laboratory is one of the things that brings stability to the world today. I think that our work is one of the many reasons why there's not been a world war since. Okay. And that's why I'm glad all of you are here. I know many of you, most of you are students, and maybe you will consider spending your career at the laboratory helping to make the world a safer and more sustainable place. Back here at the war, after the war was over, the laboratory received the Army Navy E Award for Excellence in Wartime Production. You can see Oppenheimer receiving a scroll from his boss, General Groves, there, as well as a pennant. The pennant and the scroll are both on display over at the National Security Sciences Building, the NSSB. We still have those today as a reminder. You can see Oppenheimer's improvised speech. That is the whole speech there below. And as you read through that, you might think that maybe Oppenheimer was a little bit naive. The peoples of this world have to come together and all this other stuff. I don't think that Oppenheimer was naive. I think he recognized the challenges that lay ahead. Stalin was still in the world, Soviet communism was still out there. But I think that looking at the world after the war, as so much of it lay in smoldering ruin, as tens of millions of people were dead, and as atomic bombs had been introduced as a new implement of war, not a deterrent at this point in time, how could you not be anything but hopeful and optimistic for the future? And I think that we see that reflected in Oppenheimer's speech. We don't have time for that slide, at least right now, but again, check me out on YouTube. I've almost got 500 subscribers now. If you're subscriber number 500, then I will get you a bag of M&Ms. But that is the talk for today. I hope that it was interesting. I hope that it is useful to you as you go ahead, as you move forward in your studies and your work at the laboratory. But anyway, I'm looking forward to Q&A now. Fire away, ask me those tough questions. Is that right? So Jeremy tells me we're over 500. So I owe Jeremy and maybe some of the others there. I'll bring a box of M&Ms to share with all of you. But anyway, check it out. There's a lot of good stuff there on the YouTube page. And so with that, I guess I will turn it over back to Roxanne. I think she's handling Q&A for us today. If we don't get to your question, comment, or correction today, send me an email. I do look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was really interesting. I personally enjoyed it very much. So we do have a few questions. I'll start from the top here. What did Germany and the other Axis powers know about the Manhattan Project, and how did they view it?
I don't think that they knew very much at all about it, because as to where we were kind of strapped for intelligence resources on the ground, and all of you know that there were spies in World War II, and you can find stories and books about that, but it's not like they were running around everywhere. You know, here in the United States, there were intelligence assets that helped the Germans, but I don't think the Germans or the Japanese really knew very much, at least to my knowledge, about the Manhattan Project. If you have seen otherwise, be sure and let me know, because I'd like to know a lot more about that. Now, the other major power involved here that did know about the Manhattan Project was the Soviet Union. We talked about in the presentation how the United Kingdom knew, and not only knew about it, but they were partners. They helped us get our start and then helped us as junior partners here during the Manhattan Project when it finally came into existence. Again, largely as a result of their help. The Soviet Union they were kept out. We did not tell the Soviet Union about this at all. Even after the Trinity test, President Truman did not let Joseph Stalin know about the nuclear weapons program. Why? Well, we touched on that yesterday. We never liked the Soviet Union, going all the way back to 1917, never liked the Soviet Union, and we didn't trust them. It was that brief moment in time that was World War II in which Hitler brought us all together, and with Hitler dead, everything kind of gradually fell back apart before, except there were nuclear weapons in the world. Stalin did have spies in the United States. He had spies in the Manhattan Project. He had 4 spies here at Los Alamos, and I do give a talk on that subject as well. The real experts, I think, on this are our friends Harvey Clare and John Earl Haynes. They've written a book. They wrote a book called Spies, which I highly recommend. I think it's published by Oxford. John Earl Haynes lives not far from here now. He's retired. I'm hoping to get him to come give a talk for at least some of us up here at the laboratory, but do explore their works. But Stalin knew quite a bit about this. One of his spies, the most recently discovered spy who John and Harvey unmasked, was a guy named Oscar Sabor. Sabor was in the bunker at the Trinity test. And so he was a low-ranking soldier, but that's where the geophone diagnostic instruments were, and that was his job. And so isn't it interesting that Stalin had a spy in the main bunker at the Trinity test? And so anyway, I see more coming in, but do let me know if, you know, as far as I know, I don't think the Germans or the Japanese knew an awful lot about the Manhattan Project.
Very good. The next question is somewhat related, but on the other side, did any part of the Manhattan Project involve sabotaging the German nuclear project?
Well, to some extent. And so I bet a lot of you have heard. Now I haven't seen this. I don't watch hardly any TV or anything like that. I watched that Clarkson's Farm. That's pretty good stuff there. But anyway, I'm told about some of these other Amazon shows about bombing the Norwegian heavy water factory and different things like that. So there are those examples. The Germans were, I believe, wanted to use heavy water as the moderator in their reactor, and not that easy to come by. I believe that there was a plant in Norway. It was bombed by the British during World War II. So there were some counter-proliferation efforts. At least that's one that I can think of. And had Louis' scheme to try and identify the German equivalent of Project Y. Project Y was the code name here at Los Alamos. I'm sure that there would have been a pretty significant bombing raid on the source of those fission products, but I don't think anything ever really came of that. I think that if you want to look into this, the mission that was sent into Germany right behind the frontline troops to try and gather up scientists and information, it was called the ALSOS mission. So you can look up ALSOS, ALSOS, okay? And I think that the scientific leader, his name was Sam Goudsmit. He was Dutch, if I remember correctly. He wrote a memoir about this. My friend Tom Kunkel knows a lot about ALSOS in this business as well, and I can put you in contact with Tom if you'd like to talk with him. He's also interested in trying to account for the German uranium that was collected during the war as well. But anyway, I guess that kind of answers the question at least a little bit.
Okay, we've got a related question asking about the British SAS raid on the heavy water production plant in Norway.
Right, and I touched on that a little bit, and that is, you know, I think there was a bombing raid as well. I don't know an awful lot about that, and so I will leave it to the what I'm sure 100% accurate documentaries out there. But I do think some books, some scholarly work has been done on that, and so I will defer to that instead.
Very good. We do have quite a bit of questions. Are you okay to hang out?
I've got nothing better to do. I'm enjoying my time with the students.
Fantastic.
Mm.
There is a question about Oppenheimer and his quote unquote obsession with the Bhagavad Gita and where that comes from.
You know, my new friend Patty Templeton, who just started working with us at the NSRC a week or two ago, wrote a article for Lannel Today on that, and she starts exploring that. So I think that Patty's probably our expert on that. The other source that I would, and I think that Patty may have referred to this if I'm not mistaken, two books. One is American Prometheus. These are both biographies of Oppenheimer. American Prometheus, written by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, won the Pulitzer Prize. There's a lot of information there that you can explore. The other book is by Ray Monk. I forget the title. I always forget the title of that one. I've not had a chance to read Ray Monk's book yet, but I've heard it's very good. There's also an article, and I can send you a copy of this, but it explores this topic in particular. And it is, I'm going to mispronounce the name, so I'm going to spell it instead. I think the author's name, the scholar who wrote this probably about 20 years ago, his name was James. Then I think it's Hijiya or something like that. But anyway, I can send you a copy of the article if you would like to look into that as well. I think that the Bradbury has a copy of Oppenheimer's Bhagavad Gita. And so we don't own many things at the lab that once were owned by J. Robert Oppenheimer, but I do think we have a copy of that. And you can, I don't think it's on display, but maybe if you sweet talk some of our friends over at the Bradbury, they will show it to you so you can check it out.
Very cool. Okay, so this question has popped up a couple of times. Basically, why didn't the US do a demonstration of a nuclear explosion rather than bombing a city first?
Right. So I'm glad that somebody asked that, or multiple people asked that, because this was an idea that was floated, especially after the war was over, and I think that it was greatly popularized by Edward Teller. And so we didn't talk about Edward very much in this talk, but Edward was a group leader at the laboratory during the war. He did work in the early implosion program before. These are the days before the reorg to build the Trinity device. But he also worked on the hydrogen bomb, or at least early concepts as the group leader of the supergroup, as it was then called. So a pretty significant player in wartime history. He went on to be one of the leading players in the creation of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I think that E.O. Lawrence was probably the main driver there, myself. But anyway, Edward has an interesting history, but he's the one who you're going to see that really said, yes, we should have done a demonstration first. He talked about this in books and talks and different things like that. I think the reason why you would do a demonstration is obvious, right? You get the moral high ground. You set off the bomb. You give them every chance you can before you put one of these into combat. And who knows, maybe it prompts a surrender. This is why you would do a demonstration. I wouldn't do a demonstration for a variety of reasons. And I think that some of these reasons, at least, and maybe more, are why they decided to go ahead with the attacks. So you got to look at all of these little reasons in a cumulative fashion, all right? First of all, this was a secret weapon. We didn't even tell the Soviets about it. It was a weapon of psychology. We wanted to maximize the psychological shock to the Japanese, okay? If we tip our hand first and show them this, it could blunt the psychological trauma that's caused by just unleashing one of these things without warning. So that's one reason, is we want to maximize the absolute psychological shock of putting one of these into combat, of showing the Japanese that we have an irresistible weapon. Another reason, how would you arrange the logistics? Now, it could be done, but it would be more challenging than you think. The Japanese had diplomats in Switzerland, so did we. In fact, I've got a little bit of correspondence, which is pretty interesting pertaining to the Japanese diplomats in Switzerland, if you want to ask about that later. But but anyway, we send a telegram to the Japanese and say, hey, get the emperor and all of your important military leaders and have them together at this spot at this time, looking this way. Maybe they do it, maybe they wouldn't. But anyway, that it could be done. But I think just the logistics themselves are more challenging. The other thing is that just setting it up is going to take time. And remember, every day that goes by, hundreds and hundreds of more Americans and Brits are being killed by these guys who are trying to kill them. And for sake of full disclosure, my great uncle was a Bataan survivor. He spent World War II as a Japanese prisoner. And so, he's getting beaten and starved, as are thousands of other Americans. And we know what's going on in China. So minutes matter in World War II. Days certainly matter in World War II. And so that's going to take time as well. The other thing is that, as I alluded to earlier when we were talking about the 100-ton test, blowing up nothing is not impressive. It's just not. If you set off an atomic bomb over Tokyo Bay, it's going to look like a really big bomb. There's going to be no destruction. There's going to be no death. If you do the same over Mount Fuji, it's actually not as impressive visually as you would think if you're at a distance. And we can see this, after the war was over at Operation Crossroads, there were over 40,000 people who were present for Operation Crossroads, including members of the worldwide press. And one of the takeaways was, well, that's it. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when you see something that's been destroyed, that's going to leave an impression. But when you blow up essentially nothing, and Crossroads was kind of more or less that, it just isn't that visually impressive either to blow up nothing. Another reason is that, remember, we had a finite amount of material. And so if you set off a bomb as in a demonstration, you are fissioning a huge percentage of the world's supply of enriched uranium or plutonium. This material is precious. Do we really want to, waste it, uh, blowing up nothing again? And so that is a problem with this as well. There's just, again, it's a subjective thing. Do you think that these arguments are worthwhile or good? Do you think that, no, we should have gone ahead and done a demonstration first? That kind of leads to another reason why I don't think a demonstration was a good idea. I think with the value, with the advantage of hindsight that we have, I think we can say pretty confidently, well, it wouldn't have worked anyway. It would not have extracted the surrender we were hoping for. So at the end of the day, you're left with, well, maybe seizing the high ground. Uh, that's kind of best case scenario. The Japanese didn't want to surrender after having 2 atomic bombs dropped on military targets, and the Soviets entered the war. I don't think it's demonstrated, and that's why I say I think that we can speak with confidence that the Japanese would not have surrendered as a result. So you're left with, on the one hand, the big benefit is we have the moral high ground. Uh, I think that if anything, and this is kind of getting out there a little bit into the subjective history, I think that there's more of a chance that a demonstration would have extended the war instead of shortening it. Because again, we know that the Japanese, I'm very confident the Japanese would not have surrendered based on a demonstration. The thing though is, having blunted the psychological edge before we did use these in combat, it may have prepared the Japanese mentally to face these things and could have, I could see it possibly, maybe, actually leading to a longer war as well. That's just me. A lot of it's unknowable. All of it's subjective. All of you may think, well, we should have done a demonstration anyway. That's awesome. I mean, remember, it's subjective history. We're all allowed to have our opinions on this. Alex Wellerstein wrote a very good article on the subjective nature of this history on the way. If you know Alex, if you've heard of him, you probably familiar with his work. He has a blog online. He's a professor at the Stevens Institute. He wrote an article called What Journalists Should Know About the Atomic Bombings. He wrote it a little over a year ago. It's a great article. And I think that, it shouldn't be politics. It shouldn't be emotions that drive discussions about these important matters. It should be what happened and why and what you think, what your personal values. That's going to have a lot of influence on what you think the right decision was and the wrong decision. At least for me, I think that the demonstration was just a really bad idea. And I think that policymakers and most of the scientists as well at the time, not all of them, felt the same way.
Yeah. There's a couple of related questions. The first being, uh, what was the capability at the time to launch another nuclear attack? And if it had failed, were we concerned that the Japanese would be able to recover the tech, like if the bomb didn't go off?
Let's start with the second part of the question first, then we'll go to the production rate. It was a concern that the Japanese could recover material from a bomb that didn't go off. This is why this was one of the main reasons that Trinity was necessary. If you look at Bainbridge's report, remember he's our test director, he specifically said this, we could not risk putting an atomic bomb over enemy territory, where if it didn't work, it might present the enemy with a large amount of active material in recoverable form. Now, would that material have been easy to recover? No, because the explosive would have gone off and splattered it all over the place. But anyway, it would have given the enemy an appreciable amount of material, which, though it would have been difficult, they could have recovered and at least studied, if not somehow figured out some way to employ it back against us. And so that was a consideration at the time. In terms of the production rate, thank you for asking about that, because I was going to mention it during the talk and I forgot. So we put Little Boy, the only Little Boy, into combat into combat against Hiroshima on August 6th. 3 days later, we see Fat Man used against Nagasaki. Now, at that point, the Manhattan Project basically had the authority to bomb at will. And as I alluded to, I think that President Truman was, after Trinity, pretty excited about this new capability. As pictures and films start coming back from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this technology starts to terrify him. And so General Groves, he reports to his leadership that, hey, we can put another weapon into combat around August 19th. Okay. Uh, there's a handwritten annotation on that letter from General George Marshall. If you've heard of the Marshall Plan before, yeah, the Army Chief of Staff, I believe was his title. Correct me if I've got the title wrong in chat. He writes on there that there will be no more bombings without the express consent of the president. No more bombing at will. He's pumping the brakes in a major way at that point. They're doing that because there are plenty of more weapons coming down the pipe. So I mentioned the one that would have been ready around August 19th, August 20th to go into combat. The material for that weapon had not left the continental United States. But again, with a few days, it could have been sent to Tinian and assembled and put into combat. We would have had 4 more weapons ready in September over the course of the month. Would have had 3 or 4 more in October as well. These are all Fat Man type bombs. So basically, when you look at that, we could have put an atomic bomb into combat every 10 days. And so the military's in a difficult situation because on the one hand, well, they're supposed to stop the threat. The Japanese are still trying to kill Americans every day, but the president has said, don't use these without my express consent. You don't know if that express consent is going to come in 10 minutes or if it's going to come in 10 days. You just don't know. And so the military had to plan for what they would use those weapons for. So for instance, there was discussion, well, should we use these things as they show up? Or should we collect a bunch of them and use them at the same time? Little Boy and Fat Man were used as strategic weapons. Remember when we were talking about Pearl Harbor? The Japanese had hoped for a strategic victory. They wanted to end the war with that attack. That's not what they got. We had hoped to end the war with Little Boy and Fat Man. So again, strategic function for these weapons. Well, what if the war continued? If the war continues, the military is talking about, well, maybe we need to shift from strategic use to tactical use. Maybe we need to nuke our way to Tokyo. And so, I mean, this is really difficult for the military to try and figure out what to do next. Now, at Trinity, for instance, I talked about all of the data that was collected by hand from all of the technicians and everyone else. The military wanted to know, hey, how soon can we put somebody into a nuked area after an atomic blast. What did you find out at Trinity? And again, why? Because we want to use these in a tactical manner. We want to nuke a target, send our people in to overrun it. And so, can you imagine what it would have been like if World War II would have continued? An invasion of Japan was not imminent. At the very earliest, it would have happened in early November 1945. And I believe that there was a typhoon around that same time that probably would have delayed and maybe even greatly crippled or destroyed an invading force. Okay. Fortunately, that was not necessary and it didn't happen. But can you imagine an invasion of Japan using nuclear weapons in a tactical manner, one after the other? So that's why I say it's probably a good thing that the war ended when it did, instead of just continuing on, because who knows what would have happened next. More Americans would have been killed, and nuclear weapons may have been used in a tactical manner against an enemy that had just decided we're going to dig into the very last. That's why I say it was using nuclear weapons is a horrible thing to do. I don't know if there was a better option in that horrible situation. It would have only got worse.
Yeah. There are a couple questions about some of the German aspects. One is asking, did Leo Szilard have intel that Germany actually intended to develop a port-destroying atomic bomb when he wrote his letter to the White House, or was he speculating?
I believe that he was speculating. And so the most solid piece of evidence that we had came from another physicist, but as history has kind of shown, it's not really solid at all. Have any of you heard of the play Copenhagen? Okay. This is about a meeting, not about the chewing tobacco. Okay, so there was a meeting that happened in 1942. You remember when we were talking about Niels Bohr yesterday, and we talked about how Denmark kind of avoided German occupation for quite a while until halfway through the war, and that's when Niels decided to leave. Well, back before, when things were kind of sort of nice under pseudo German occupation, Werner Heisenberg, who was kind of the de facto leader of the German project, paid a visit to Niels Bohr, and they met in Copenhagen and had a discussion. Now, even though Heisenberg and Bohr lived for years and years after this, there are different accounts of what was said at that meeting, and it's unclear. One of the things that is debated, I can send you an article on this if you would like to look at it, is, well, how much information did Heisenberg give to Bohr? It's possible that Bohr may have even made a sketch of the German nuclear weapons design that they were talking about. And when we talk about German design, it's not what you would think. It's not something, and I may be way off on this. Do consult the real experts. But I don't think that the Germans were designing an atomic bomb as we would think of an atomic bomb. I think that they were thinking more along the lines of just a reactor that would irradiate people, and we'll drop that out of a plane or something like that. According to some accounts of this story, Bohr ended up with a drawing of this airborne irradiating reactor thing and brought it all the way back to Los Alamos. Now, we don't have that drawing. I wish we did. I would like to show it during tours. We don't know if it was even made. On the one hand, you have people who say, yes, a drawing of this thing was definitely made. On the other hand, you have people like Niels Bohr's son, who was with him at the time, who said he most certainly did not make anything like that. Who knows? There's a good article by Jeremy Bernstein on this. Again, I could send that to you if you would like to look at it. I don't know if we'll ever know, but that is probably as close to, and again, that wasn't gathered through intelligence. That was a couple of physicists who were meeting together. Of course, Niels goes to Sweden and then goes to the United Kingdom and to the United States. And this is still, and I think it always will be, very, very murky, but that's probably the closest thing that well, it is the closest thing I'm aware of that kind of fits into that category there. So again, I may have raised more questions than answers there, but hopefully that's at least a little bit helpful.
Yeah, and sort of in a similar area, did the Allies know about the German Hagerloch reactor facility during the war?
I don't know about that. You might look at the at Goudsmith's book Alsos, and again, we can ask Tom, my friend Tom Kunkel, about that. Tom's retired in the laboratory. I think you may still find him in the phone book, but he does not look at lab email, and so Tom does know quite a bit about this. And if you'd like to follow up, send me an email. We'll forward your question on to Tom, and I'd be curious to see what he has to say about that. Don't hesitate to drop me a line.
Very cool. Those are the last of our student questions. If you'll indulge me, I do have a question about Enrico Fermi. I had one of my favorite physics professors in college used to love to give us what she called Fermi problems, and she would tell this story about how Fermi ripped up a piece of paper during a blast test and let the pieces of paper flutter away as the shockwave hit them, and then whipped out a slide rule and approximated the power of that blast. Is there documentation of that, or is that just myth?
That's a complete no, actually there is documentation. And so
Ah,
you will be excited to know that we own the original documentation for that over at the NSRC. And so if you visit us, I will let you hold that. We have it in a protective sleeve that's UV proof, or at least heavily resistant. You can read it yourself and have it there in your hands and enjoy it. So after the Trinity test, the scientists were encouraged to record their observations. What did it look like? Where were you? What happened? Did, all that kind of stuff. And we have lots of accounts, including Fermi's original typed up observations. It's on one page of paper. It is publicly releasable. And so I can, if you can't make it over to the NSRC, I can at least send you a nice scan of the document. Two paragraphs, a long paragraph, then a shorter one. The shorter paragraph at the bottom of the page explains the experiment. So Fermi was at the base camp, and I believe that the base camp was 17,000 yards from zero. Oppenheimer was closer at 10,000 yards, but at the base camp, you had Fermi, you had General Groves, you had Vannevar Bush, who we talked about a little bit yesterday as well. So what you described is exactly right. Fermi had a sheet of paper. He tore it into pieces. Before the blast, he drops one of the piece of paper. There's not very much of a breeze, and it basically just goes straight down. Now, when an atomic bomb goes off, you don't hear anything for a long time, relative long time. Remember, the light travels a whole lot faster than sound. And so you see this brilliant flash, and then it took like 40 plus seconds for the shock wave and the sound to arrive at base camp. So when it finally arrives, by the way, I've got a good video on of a shock wave arriving after a nuclear blast over on my YouTube channel. I forget the name of it, but anyway, it's kind of cool because you see this blast, then it pans over, and the people are just sitting there on the bleachers, and all of a sudden, boom, the shock wave shows up. And the comparison that I would make is when the shock wave shows up, it can be a pretty violent event depending on where you are. Imagine it going from being pretty quiet to all of a sudden somebody firing a pistol back behind your head. So you get a lot of noise and somebody putting a leaf blower on high right in your face. So that is the shock wave. As that unfolds, Fermi drops additional pieces of paper. They are shifted, I believe, 2.5 meters. And so based on how far the blast had shifted the paper, Fermi does an off-the-cuff estimate of yield, and he estimates that it is equivalent to 10,000 tons of TNT. So he's basically off by a factor of 2 with a blank sheet of paper on the fly. Remarkable and well documented. And again, send me an email. I'll send you the document. I think I saw somebody mention in chat there, or asked, well, how can we visit the NSRC? How can we see this cool stuff? What you can do is you can send an email to nsrc@lanel.gov, National Security Research Center at lanel.gov, nsrc@lanel.gov, and say, hey, I'd like to tour the facility. We don't like to show just individuals because that's really inefficient. What we'd like to do is show maybe you and 5 to 10 or more, depending on how big your group of friends is. But we'd like to show you and a group of your friends around our facility. We're one of the larger libraries of any kind in the country. We have over 14 million objects in our collection. We have records going back to World War II. And if you put in your request at nsrc.gov, let us know how many people you have. Let us know if your group is going to be uncleared or cleared. I know most of you are students. Many of you may not have clearances. that's fine. We can bring you into our vault anyway. We just won't be able to show you as much cool stuff. If your group is all cleared, though, we will tell you the story of Little Boy and Fat Man from the classified perspective. So we talked unclassified at the publicly releasable level earlier today, but if you're cleared, there are other things we can show you. But regardless of if you're cleared or not, you can definitely see Fermi's observations among many other interesting things.
Very cool. Thank you so much. I don't want to keep you much longer. You've been very kind to stay with us so much longer than we first planned. But again, thank you. That was very interesting. And I bet you'll have a lot more YouTube subscribers after this.
Man, I hope so. I'm excited about 500, and Roxanne, Kelly, Michael, thanks for putting this together. Others I've forgotten. And man, what great crowds both days. So thanks to all of you. And I hope our paths will cross again really soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Alan.
Take care.